All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I have a short webinar kind of announcement, Q&A around a decommission notice that Infor put out related to the interface between HR Talent and Infor HRM, or otherwise known as GHR and Lawson. Before we get started on the content, just wanted to talk a little bit about Intellius for those of you who may not be familiar. We've been in the Lawson space since 1999, so 20 plus years. We are an Infor Alliance partner. So on our services side, we are specialized in Lawson and certified to work on version 10, version 11 products. We have offices in Chicago and Dallas, consultants based all across the US. Typical things that we do, technical services around Infor products, upgrades, application or functional consulting, cloud services, both with the Lawson 10 and Cloud Suite version 11 products, implementations, upgrades, and migrations. And then we also have a number of software products that we've been selling for a number of years around the Lawson benefits and payroll job automation suite. So pretty simple agenda, just going to talk about what the announcement means, key takeaways or key points, kind of planning and action items, and then at the end, open it up for questions. First of all, who's impacted? A lot of customers email me asking that, does this matter to me? Am I impacted by this? Pretty much anyone running a combination of Infor HR Talent and the HRM payroll together is impacted by this. I think it's very confusing. Infor keeps changing the names of some of these products, so I included some formerly known as. So HR Talent is equivalent to LTM or Global HR, GHR, TM, Talent Management, Cloud Suite HCM. All of those words kind of refer to the same product, which is now called Infor HR Talent as of the April release. All the branding, the documentation, support site was changed over to reflect that new terminology. And then HRM payroll is simply the Lawson or S3 B10 payroll. So if you're running both of these applications, then you are using a delivered interface to send data between them, most importantly or certainly for your employee data. And then there's a number of other data feeds that you may or may not use depending on where you do benefits, where you do absence management, things like that. It really doesn't matter about the deployment. In this case, I think multi-tenant customers may be moved to this more quickly, or they may be in a position to move to it more quickly because they're already on the more current version or the latest version that supports this, and there is an upgrade that would be required to move to this type of interface model. But still for the single tenant customers in the cloud or even the on-premise customers, ultimately you are going to be impacted by this decommission notice, which is ultimately saying that, at some point in the future, Q2 2022, they're really not going to be fixing or enhancing the legacy interface, and they're encouraging all customers to move to this new interface model. And we'll talk a little bit more about what exactly that means and what's changing. So again, this is impacting the Infor delivered interfaces that send data bi-directionally, really, between GHR, HR Talent, and the Lawson payroll system. The biggest change is that Infor process automation is not as big of a part of the solution. The interfaces today, if you're running them, probably painfully familiar with them, Infor process automation is used to move data between the systems, and it works by making what are called AGS transactions or API calls between the systems to add, update, or change individual records. And so that functionality is what's being replaced by basically moving flat files between the systems. And Infor has leveraged a new utility called the file creation utility, or FCU, to assist with some of that flat file generation, ultimately. So IPA is still part of the new process, but not 100% of the process going forward. So at a high level, this is what the interface looks like today in the current world, or I guess we can call it the old interface. Everything in gray is not changing. It's still the exact same process. And the purple component is what's changing. So in GHR, when you have the interface turned on and someone's hired, for example, that will write a record to an export table in GHR, like employee export. And there's lots of other export tables and lots of other data feeds, but they all follow the same process. So to keep it simple, just focus on the employee data at this point. After the data is in that export holding table or staging table, you're running Infor process automation workflows, like the HRM employee export flow, for example, to read that export data, map it, and then add it to the Lawson system on the receiver tables. And so the employee receiver table is called HRM receiver. On top of that is the LT11.1, and then you use the LT111 or LT101, the old program, to basically run a batch process to read out of those receiver tables, the LT11, and then ultimately update forms or application tables like HR11, PA02, HR06, HR07, etc. So that's kind of the overall process. Again, IPA is what's moving the data between the databases today. In the new world, it's a combination of this FCU and SFTP process. So the file creation utility, if you've never heard of that before, is something you should definitely be checking out. It's what Infor leverages to build flat files to be sent to Lawson, but it also can be used to build your own flat file. So it's basically like a low code, no code type of data extraction tool to build comma delimited file or delimited files, flat files, fixed width, etc. from database tables in GHR. And so you can use it for any number of integration. It's a very powerful tool, but Infor has also chosen to use this to build their own extracts, to build flat files, basically dumped out of the export tables. Those are then transferred to an FTP or SFTP server. They are or can be optionally encrypted with PGP. And then an IPA process basically picks up those files and imports it directly to the receiver table. So functionally, really nothing's changing much, but technically quite a lot is changing. However, you still have the same receiver tables, the same LT11, the same LT111. Nothing else changes after that fact. It's just purely how are we moving the data between the GHR and Lawson system? What mechanism or what technologies are being used to do that? So the old interface is 100% Infor process automation, and it's using those AGs or API calls to update LT111 directly. It's very, or can be, very slow. If you load thousands and thousands of transactions into GHR, it might take 8 hours, 12 hours or more sometimes to interface those because of using that API engine. The new interface uses a combination of the FCU to extract and build a flat file, IPA and or ION to then move that file between an SFTP server or to an SFTP server, and then from the SFTP server onto Lawson. And then there are new special programs called the LT5XX. There's a number of them, but basically all those are doing is reading the flat file and batch importing it into the receiver table. So because it's moving flat files and because we're using COBOL programs to import the data directly to the database, it runs much, much, much faster than the legacy interface. That's a huge benefit, in my opinion, for customers. Aside from the fact that you're kind of being encouraged or forced to move to this new model, the one benefit you would get, or there's really two benefits. One is it's much faster, and two is that it's potentially more secure. The security thing really comes more from when you're dealing with the multi-tenant cloud environment, because ultimately if it were to be using API calls to update your Lawson system directly, that Lawson system would need to be exposed on the public internet. And so by using flat files and SFTP transfer, we don't have to do that. So you can keep your Lawson system behind the firewall, and thus it can be more secure in theory. But the biggest takeaway is that it's faster. What stays the same? The GHR export tables stay the same. You're still running the LT11, LT111 programs, and you still have the cross-reference table for mapping. So it's purely about how are we moving the data from GHR to Lawson that's changing. Everything else about the interface process pretty much remains the same. So the impacted data feeds, we've been talking about employee because that's one that pretty much everyone is using. The positions, jobs, supervisors, probably the same thing. But ultimately, what you should understand is that all of these interfaces between the two systems have been modified for the export or updated, modernized. Anything moving from GHR to Lawson has been rebuilt to use the file creation utility to extract data to flat files and be transferred to an SFTP and then imported or consumed to the Lawson system. And then the other way, from Lawson to GHR, all of those interfaces have also been modified to support flat file transmission, database imports, and batch processing. So it's bi-directional, and all of these have been updated to use these new standards. From a planning perspective, what does this mean? Ultimately, per the decommission notice or critical notification, so the old or the legacy interface, basically those IPA flows using AGS calls, they're going to be no longer supported ultimately as of some point in Q2 next year. What that means is that if you have an issue with that interface, or there are enhancements made to the interface, you're stuck. Any changes, any net new functionality they bring after that point in time is only going to be with the new FCU interface. You will only be supported if you truly have like a priority one production down issue. Those will continue to be triaged, but anything else you're seeing with potentially mapping errors or additional fields that you're expecting to see brought into the interface, any new functionality or features that are brought to that interface, you would have to move into the new flat file-based SFTP interface in order to get those. Minimum version. So the interface is part of the application source code. And so in order to get to this new modern interface, you're going to have to be on a relatively recent version of Global HR. The minimum version you need to be on is 11.0.36 or CU36 for the 11.0x release. I would recommend going to the highest available version because, again, they continue to release new functionality and feature sets. So if this is something you're not going to get to for 6 to 8 months, and you're on premise, don't target CU36, try to go to the highest one, but know that in order to even look at this and turn it on and use it, you have to be at a minimum of CU36 on GHR 11.0x. With that, you may be, a lot of on-premise customers are nowhere near that version. Understand that upgrade, that jump, if you are still on GHR 11.0.0x or a landmark 10, can be a significant jump. So it's not something that you can just apply a patch and turn it on. That jump impacts a lot of other things in the application. So plan for that. If you're going to have to be forced to apply this larger update, understand that as a whole, going to probably be a more involved effort or project than just simply turning on this interface. Infor has delivered an easy button, quote unquote, to turn this on. So it should be kind of plug and play. I would recommend consulting the product documentation for more information about this transition. Docs.infor.com, public website. You can go to the Global HR Info Center there and find all the information on this called the HRM flat file interface. So definitely look there to understand what the process is and what's involved for turning it on. And I would say the expected implementation timeline, that's kind of broad, but at least a month, I would say, to configure and enable this new feature, and then ultimately, do some level of or amount of parallel testing, the old and the new, making sure things are processing, that you have all the FTP connections set up and there's file channels involved to move the data, kind of end-to-end regression testing the new feature set. I would say plan for at least a month to do that. And that kind of concludes the content I had. We'd be happy to meet with anyone individually and kind of talk through this. Intellius does have experience working with this new integration, configuring it, turning it on, as well as obviously the old interface, but also be happy to open it up to questions now in the chat, or if someone wants to unmute themselves, be happy to answer those now.
Rob, I have a question. This is Bana.
I can hear you.
One of your slides said LT 111 is not changing. You had the slide which said same. Yeah, this one. So if LT 111 is not changing, then can we continue using LT 111? So how does that 511, what's the difference between LT 511 and LT 111?
Okay, so the 511 basically loads data to the LT 111, reads records from the LT 11, right? That's the LT 11 is the receiver table maintenance, and the LT 111 reads records from the LT 11 and then uploads them to the system. What will be changing is how data gets into the LT 11. So the LT 500 series programs, really all they are is like an import DB, basically. So it's taking a flat file and importing it to the receiver tables to the LT 11 so that it can then be picked up by the 111 for processing. So it almost inserts another step. I guess I should have had that in my diagram, but part of this arrow process, and it's all automated in this prepackaged IPA workflows, but basically there'll be a file channel set up with your Lawson system that picks up the file from the SFTP server and then puts it on the Lawson file system and then kicks off one of these LT 500 series jobs to actually load it into the staging tables in the Lawson database that the LT 11 sits on top of.
Okay, so is there any change from the business side, Rob? Because what I'm hearing is it's only the technical part. Instead of the AGS call, we'll now have the file creation utility and we'll have an IPA flow. So it's the technical part that is changing. How about the business side? Is there any tables, the way records are getting created in S3? Is any of that changing?
It should not, no. The business side should remain largely, the only real change to the business would be that they could expect faster processing time for sending data between the two systems. So I know that's something a lot of organizations struggle with, is if they throw in a bunch of pay changes at year end or something, and you hit the system with 5,000 transactions, it could take a whole day for those to be sent down to Lawson. That's a delay potentially to the business. So the flat file interfaces, the new version, should cut down that processing time significantly. So that would be a potential win or impact or positive change to the business. But otherwise, this is 100% kind of a back-end technical change. The way export records are generated, the way they're loaded into Lawson, where the data goes, kind of the start and end points, will remain pretty much exactly the same.
Thank you. I have one more question. I looked at the patch that we need to install for this, and like the preview, and there was two programs, PR 5 and 4, 5 and 3 and 5 and 4, but I saw more of 5 and 4 change impact to it. So is there other programs? Do you know what changes are happening to this PR 5 and 4 program?
The 514.
514.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I mean, what's changing would largely be dependent on each customer and kind of what kind of maintenance they've been doing, what MSP level they're on, what CTP they have. I don't know exactly all what's included in the patch bundle, but what changes to the 514 is, and it's been a while, I don't remember when this changed over, but the old, if you're sending deductions from or W4s elections from GHR to Lawson, like if you're running GHR benefits, you know, and your benefit deductions are in GHR and you're sending them over, the legacy interface wrote directly to the PR14 online form, and the new interface basically uses the PR514 to do batch file processing or flat file processing of the deductions. So the changes to PR514 are to support, you know, traditionally the 514 was used to load converted deductions, you know, when you come on to Lawson, and it's been modified or retrofitted to support the interface, continued interfacing of deductions from GHR to Lawson.
This is Leslie. Just a follow-up question to that, and because I understand you're talking about it, interfacing data from G4.
It's very quiet. If Leslie, you're trying to ask a question, I can't really hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is it better?
Chad, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
We haven't used that 511 a lot, but we use the 514 and the 530, the PR 530. But the one thing I remember about those 500 series loads was finding the proper import key. I even forget what it was called. It was a field that you had to include in order to get it to work right. Has any of that changed?
Potentially. I mean, I would say someone asked where to find the documentation. So if you go to docs.infor.com, ERP, where's the HCM, people, HR talent. So they keep changing this stuff. It's hard to find it. So you go to people, HR talent, and then you go to the Infor talent online documentation. And you go to administrator integrations. There's a section here, and I can put it in the chat for the WebEx. Section here called HRM flat file integration. And so they talk about all of the steps to configure this, and then some of it is on the jobs that need to be set up. Forget where they all are, but it talks about the different jobs and parameters and things like that. How to configure the PGP encryption. All of that's in here. And it depends on, you know, whether or not you'll be using the 512, PR512, PR514, PR530, kind of depends on what modules you've implemented in GHR. If you have benefits in GHR, that's different than if your benefits are in Lawson still, or you have some other system for that. So not all of these integration feeds would be relevant, but obviously pretty much everyone is using the employee positions, jobs, and supervisors.
Okay,
Rob, can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay, sorry about that before. This might be a not a great question since it's just a file feed into S3, but we use PR 514 and PR 530 weekly from external benefit vendor to bring in benefit deductions and imputed income, things like that. Just wondering, as part of that month testing, do you think they've changed PR 514 or 530? Those files have been around forever. Just wondering if I'm going to need to reach out to those vendors to have them change the incoming files they send us.
I'm not exactly, there could be a change to them. You know, I would
Okay.
expect that well, you would assume, I guess, that they would regression test those changes, and so it wouldn't break any net new functionality. If anything, there might be new fields to support GHR, but that you can
Okay.
continue as is, would be my thought. Obviously, you would need to test that.
Sure.
But that would be my initial thought
Okay.
or assumption.
And I just wanted to get your opinion on one last thing. We currently use LT101 to update data from LT111, from LT11, and we are trying to move or testing to move to LT111, and just want to know if you have an opinion about if LT111 is better than LT101.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the LT111 is what you should be using.
Okay.
I believe from what I've seen, especially when you're on the newer version of Global HR, the 11.0x release, the interface is kind of built with the assumption that you would be using that.
Okay.
The biggest difference is that, and there's other differences, but the biggest difference is the LT101 loads entire records, whereas the LT111 is more like delta change to impact. So it won't bring records through if there's no relevant change to field that Lawson cares about.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. That helps a lot. Thank you so much, Rob.
Mm-hmm.
Hey there, this is Johnny from Children's. I actually work with Leslie and Pana. My question's from the business point of view, and forgive me if it's not that sophisticated of a question, but I gotta ask it anyway because it's sitting on my brain. So, using the old method or the current method, I could call it, I'm able to go to the export records, and sometimes I'm in a situation where, you just right click and export that one record that's waiting to be processed so that it can get sent to S3 and I can deal with it there in real time. When we're switching from the API focused method to the flat file method, do I lose that quote unquote real timeness? Or for me, from the business standpoint, is that not even noticeable? I still have that capability. And I know that's just one example, but if
No, yeah, I get what you're saying. I wouldn't say if you set this up by the book, it should be near real time. You will lose some speed because when you click that button now, it makes an API call within 30 seconds or whatever,
Yes.
however long it takes the process flow to run, and it hits Lawson directly.
yes,
This will be set up or can be set up to be automated end to end, but there is a slight delay. So the export will put a file on an SFTP server. And then on Lawson, we have something called a file channel set up to basically pull that location and look there it can be as frequently as 1 minute, or it can be longer than that. Pick up the file and then import it. So, it's going to be a little bit slower and, but potentially not significantly. If you set up your file channels to look for files every single minute, then it might go down for, what was 10 seconds is now 2 minutes or something.
the book
so-
or default, by the book, how many times or how fast is between lookups is Lawson hitting that FTP trying to grab files?
It
Or
can
is
be
that
one
us?
minute is the fastest.
Okay.
So one of the other different things for those of you who are already on the cloud, you may be aware of this, or in multi-tenant and you're on the newer version. If you're on premise, you might not be aware of this yet, but they've basically built, in addition to this, or as you're going through this migration, there's a whole new web application delivered called the Integration Architect that all of this is delivered with. And it includes much, much more than just this one little piece of the delivered interface. But this web application is where you'll go to do all this configuration. And in my opinion, it gives a lot more visibility, usability, control over the process. If you are one of those people who is managing mapping errors and looking at the export tables and potentially sending records manually and things like that, you know, that Integration Architect web application, in my opinion, is a much nicer user experience than the old admin utilities interface records, blah, 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 blah. So they've revamped a lot of that.
Hello, I have a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
I submitted the decommission notice to GSC or support for some recommendations. And as you mentioned confusion in the naming, there was quite a bit of confusion in the response on the decommission notice, almost to the point saying that it really only affected cloud customers, which you have stated in your slide that is not true. And also that if the company choose or has not implemented 11.0.36 or higher, it didn't apply to you anyway because those features do not even exist. So if the company chooses to stay at the version they're at, whether that's in extended support or chooses not to upgrade, that this new feature or new requirement doesn't apply to them, which contradicts,
well, I think,
you know, part of your slides, but it also contradicts what Infor is saying in the notice.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of have to read between the lines with the notice. Okay, if, let's say you're stabilized, you have no problems right now, and you're just going to run out whatever CU you're on into the future, sure, you know, you don't need to take action. But the reality is, it's a vended application, and you should not be doing that. There are the way CUs are delivered with GHR for regulatory things. Tax withholding, W4 is a great one. 2020, big change. You can't just take a CTP. It's a CU and it's cumulative and got to update. So at some point, you know, on-prem, you have more control over when this happens. But at some point, you're going to have to upgrade the application. And whenever you get to something higher than 11.0.36, and it's after Q2 2022, and you start to have issues, they're basically saying in this decommission notice that unless it's priority one, we're not going to help you. So my opinion is you kind of have to read between the lines to understand how you're impacted as an on-premise customer. But the reality is you're going to have to upgrade your GHR system at some point. And when you do, I think you're going to start running into these issues. The cloud customers, I think it's more urgent because they're forced to upgrade and they're already going to be on these newer versions. And if I'm in the cloud and I have an on-premise Lawson system still for payroll, the security to me is huge. I wouldn't want my Lawson system exposed on the public internet. And if I'm moving data from the public internet back to my on-premise data center, I'd want it to be PGP encrypted. I'd want it to go through SFTP. So there's a whole lot of other reasons on the technical side that I would want to do that as the cloud customer. Does that help answer your question?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you very much.
But, you know, I would look at it for on-prem. You know, obviously you're still probably using a legacy interface. Not something maybe that you do the end of this year, or I don't really know, but it's something I keep on the radar and understand that, hey, once we start to, whenever we do that upgrade, whenever we get to the latest 11.0 XCU, wherever that falls on our roadmap, we should start to think about including moving over to this interface as part of that project. I would kind of bundle those two together for two reasons. One, the benefit of speed, which we talked about. For two, potentially, depending on where your payroll system is or where you're moving to the cloud, you might be forced to be onto this at some point anyway. And it's quite clear that enhancements and changes to the product are only going to be pushed to this new version in the future. And so, that's kind of how I would approach it.
I believe as a company, our biggest hurdle when you get far enough back in versions is the prerequisites of one to the other. To have the newer version of GHR, you need to be on landmark 11 with a minimum version. And then if you're running LSF or S3, you've got to go to 10.0.10 or 10.0.11, you need a minimum. So there are so many prerequisites that you get caught in a catch-22 that, like you said, at some point, you're going to have to bite the bullet and upgrade.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It really snowballs with all the dependencies. And that's kind of why I called out, if you're not on GHR 11.0x yet, this is a much larger discussion, conversation than simply, oh, we want to move to this new interface. It's a much bigger project and effort and the scope than just looking at the interface.
So if you're a company that's possibly evaluating moving from on-prem to cloud and doing a big bang type implementation, this could expedite things.
Potentially. And I would say, if I'm not yet on GHR 11.0x and I want to move to the cloud at some point in the future, I would argue it would be beneficial to your organization to do that upgrade on premise before you get to the cloud. Because ultimately, the data is going to have to be upgraded as part of that project anyway. I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head where those migration paths are, but you're going to have to do like a double skip upgrade or something. And that's significant. So from a technology perspective, maybe we can do that for you. But my biggest concern would be logistically, what we have to remember is that in the cloud, the updates are applied every single month. You're taking a CU every single month. They're small, typically, and the changes are manageable. But when we're trying to do parallel testing and upgrade and move from on-prem GHR to the cloud GHR, because we know that we're dealing with a moving target, because we're taking patches every month, I want to do that as fast as I possibly can. And in my opinion, the best way to do that is have your on-premise production as close as you can possibly get to the cloud version, so that the delta of the change that you're testing against is much smaller. And thus you can have a shorter upgrade project. So that would be my personal opinion on the approach. For customers looking to evaluate when to look at upgrading or moving to the cloud, and what to invest into your on-premise system ahead of that type of project.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. There's only one other question in the chat. Does the easy button include the creation of the artifacts for the SFTP process? Yes. I mean, there's still some configuration you have to do, but like setting up jobs and PGP keys, and it's not a one button click, but it does a lot of it. I will be honest, my exposure to this was as a beta customer, but we didn't have the easy button when I turned it all on. I haven't personally used the easy button yet, but looking through the documentation and seeing what is automated, it's fairly extensive. It covers a lot of things. All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, again, we will be sending out recording of the webinar and I think the slide deck. So you'll be getting those if you registered. I also have my email listed here. Feel free to reach out with any other questions or follow-ups you might have. But that concludes today's presentation. Thank you very much for your time for joining us. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Rob. Great presentation.
Yes, thank you very much.